UVM Medical Center is looking for 12 new phlebotomists to join their team. No experience required. Vermont High Tech is accepting applications for the UVM Medical Center Certified Phlebotomist Training Program. Programs are 8 weeks of free education. A high school diploma or GED is required. Apply online at www.iaahightech.org. Deadline to apply is May 2nd, 2021. These programs are funded in part by the U.S. and Vermont Department of Labor.
So, morning all, welcome. Sorry about the tardiness. We just had a minor slowdown here. We have to, again, figure out a way to get people vaccinated. I'm sorry to be that pain in the ass and keep coming back to COVID, but we've got to get people vaccinated in some way and explain to them the importance of being vaccinated. This morning was dealing with a company that potentially will be shut down for the week. Hey, Cecil, only about 15 people had contact with the positive, okay? Wow. And the bad part is, all of them, except for one, was eligible for their shots about 2 weeks ago.
Wow.
So
we're on the list to get our shots.
yeah, now we got to make it happen. We're going to discuss confined space today. Should be a far-reaching and interesting piece. I will tell you, it's probably one that you're going to want to have the ability to talk back and forth or question me on a few things. But if you have questions, please feel free to ask them. How we handle that is up to you. Whether we ask, whether you raise your hand or you just hit your mic and go live, either way. But the confined space thing has, one, really changed, and two, requires a great deal of documentation. But once that documentation is in place, once we've got it where we need it, it allows us to move fairly easily in and out of these confined spaces. So one of the pieces here that it discusses is what is a confined space. And within the construction world, they have defined 2 or 3 different types of confined space. The one we're most used to, and the minute I say confined space, we all tend to go to that permit piece. And we all tend to go immediately to the having to set the tripod up, the rescue piece. That is required within the permit piece. And what they've done in the construction side is allowed you to use alternative measures to enter these confined space, but it's all based on some data collection and history with those confined space. And you can use those pieces to make it easier for you to work in and out of a confined space. Now, one of the pieces, and I want to there, you should have that on your screen. And this will be on the website with the video, of course. But one of the pieces that as we get into the construction standard for confined space is, and I like starting with frequently asked questions, because this is really important. When OSHA mentions confined space, they mention them in 2 aspects. And one of them is, they say, what is a confined space? And the other one is, what is a permit required confined space? So we've got to separate those two. And to start with, this is the first time in a standard that an owner or a host actually takes responsibility. An owner or a host has responsibility to define, to do an inventory, and to tell you what type of confined space exists. Now, if you're an owner or a host, you're probably going to define or do your inventory, and I found towns and villages and cities, they didn't really do an inventory. What they did was they just defined everything out there as a permit required confined space. That's what they said. Everything's permit. And the minute they do that, you've got to prove it otherwise, and you've got to create your own inventory or survey for those confined spaces that you're working. Then you've got to go back to the host or the owner and say, hey, we changed that DI to a non-permit or to a routine entry because that's what we do. And they have to agree to you doing that. But it's important we understand the definition of a confined space, limited means of entry and or exit. Limited means of entry or exit. Large enough for a worker to enter and not intended for regular or continuous occupancy. Now, they did tell you in there that that includes sewers, pits, crawl spaces, attics. And as a matter of fact, they added the crawl space and attic piece from in the past. So if you're working under a mobile home, if you're in a ranch style home, you're doing something in those areas, that attic or that basement, that cellar, that underneath could in essence become a confined space. But very clear, it's a confined space. It doesn't have to be a permit required confined space, because a permit required confined space is a confined space that may have a hazardous atmosphere, an engulfment hazard, or other serious hazards such as exposed wiring that can interfere with a worker's ability to leave the space without assistance. Then they ask, can anyone work in a confined space? Well, workers that have been properly trained and assigned or authorized, they use the word authorized, to work in, and they're very clear in this, in permit space may do so. There are training requirements for confined space entry, but they spell out pretty clearly what those other training requirements are for a permit space. Additionally, before workers can enter a permit space, the employer has to write a permit that specifies what safety measures must be taken and who is allowed to go in. So right off the bat, they're starting to spell out that there is a difference between a permit space and a confined space. They ask, do I follow general industry or the construction industry? If you're doing construction or maintenance, you follow the construction standard. If you're doing work within the general industry purview, then you follow the general industry standard. But you would not go wrong by following the construction standard at all times. How does it differ? In the in other processes or previous rules? Well, the rule requires employers to determine the kinds of spaces their workers are in, and it requires you to do an inventory prior to entry and to do a survey prior to entry. Where in the past, you would have your confined space permit and just start working. So again, as I said early on, that if you do a permit, if you do a survey, and if you define these as non-permits or just a confined space, then really you've made the whole process a lot easier along the way. Are employers required to have a confined space program? Well, this is kind of the caveat to this, because they say, yes, if the workers will enter permitted spaces, you will need a confined space program, whether you're going into a permitted space or you're just going into a confined space, because again, unless someone tells us that these are just confined spaces or non-permitted spaces, we have to do an inventory and we have to treat everything as a permit until we prove it otherwise. So I'm going to tell you on the back side of this that it is a requirement that you have a written program to start with. Contact, who's affected by subpart AA? All construction employers whose workers are exposed to confined space hazards. Do I need to do anything if there's a permit space at the work site? And again, we have to define right off the bat if it's permit or if it's just a confined space. So yes, we do, you gotta take effective steps. And then if I hire a contractor or a subcontractor to do work in a confined space, do I have responsibilities? And here's where that starts to play in. Just what I said. A controlling contractor and host employers must discuss spaces on the site and their hazards with those entry employers. The rule makes the controlling contractor, rather than the host employer, the primary point of contact. If there's no controlling contractor, so when we start, if there's no controlling contractor, then the host employer or the developer or owner own this space. If there's a controlling contractor, there becomes a very specific relationship between the host employer or the owner, the controlling contractor, and everybody involved. The host employer owns this thing. That host employer or owner has to do an inventory and define what type of confined space they have on their facility, within their facility or within the scope of this project. They have to do that. And before entry, they have to share it with the controlling contractor. And if I took JPC card and I said, JPC card, we're gonna repipe some DIs through Barton. What has to happen is Barton has to define the present status of their DIs, which in most cases, they won't do an inventory anyway. All they will do is take a list of those confined spaces, those DIs, DI1, DI2, DI3, and they'll turn around and just say they're permit required. That's what they'll do. And then it's up to you as the controlling contractor to turn around and recategorize or reassess. And you would reassess those, go back to the host employer, get him to agree to it, and then come to your subcontractor or your employees and tell them, we've done a survey, we've recategorized these, and these are now just confined spaces, not permit required confined spaces. But to do so, it requires you to go out and do an air test and check every one of these for an engulfment hazard, electrical hazard, or whatnot, and sign off on the fact that those hazards do not exist, which would make it a permit required confined space. Now, if you choose not to do that, two aspects. If you choose not to do that, it remains a permitted space until whoever is doing the entry, the subcontractor that is doing the entry, then has to come over here to do the recategorization and has to report to you. You have to report to them, and then the host has to report back to you, and then you have to report back to the subcontractor. So again, far easier for you to do it at the initial stages and initial planning of this process than to wait for your subs or whoever's doing the entry to actually deal with that later on. That's a big one there. Any questions? Any questions? Matt, Carl, I can't believe you don't have a question on that. Okay. Five key differences when we look at the general industry standard versus the new construction standard. And probably the biggest difference in the whole thing is the fact that it requires continuous air monitoring. Regardless of whether it's a permit space or a non-permit space, it requires continuous air monitoring throughout this entry. So if you're going into a DI, you're going into a manhole, you're going into a utility vault that's more than 4 feet deep, which would constitute a confined space, then at that point you will have constant air or continuous air monitoring. They also built into this more detailed provisions. Just what I was saying back here, there's more detailed provisions because we have to know what everybody is doing within the scope of this entry. What everybody's responsibility is, and everything has to be documented when it comes to that whole coordination piece. From the host employer to the controlling contractor to the subcontractor, being able to coordinate throughout the duration of this entry. One of the big things though is they allowed a competent person to evaluate the work site and not only identify the confined spaces, but they also allowed them to identify the types of confined spaces. So a competent person could go through, do an inventory and say, those 5 over there are non-permit or routine entry, and this one over here is a permit. They also continuous atmospheric monitoring, and they say whenever possible. I'll tell you what they actually use within the standard is when it's when a monitor is made to do this, we have to use air monitoring. If there's no monitor made, then it would not be possible. It also requires continuous monitoring of any other type of hazards that would be out there. But one of the bigger ones, when I was looking at it and reviewing it, allowed for the suspension of a permit instead of cancellation. And in the past, and we may not have always followed this to the letter of the law, but in the past, if you came out of a permit, if you came out of a confined space and turned around and said, well, we aren't going back in there for a couple hours, you had to cancel that permit, and you had to start all over from ground zero. Now they've gone with that suspension piece, which is what we tended to do most often. Was I would come out, we would just stop the entry, and then I would go back and enter again based on the data that I had been collecting. So we're pretty good at that versus cancellation. So that's, they included that. They've also added some other provisions to it. Employers who direct workers to enter a space without using a complete permit system, again, we've got to ensure that we've eliminated any and all hazards, and it does allow, i.e., if we have an incident within a confined space, i.e., air monitor going off, something more the employees, but I can use a blower or whatnot to clear that space, and then we can continue work. And I get one shot as the monitor goes back on, everybody becomes a permit required confined space. We are relying on local, and this is huge, because we talk about the minute I start emergency services, or emergency, and if I EMT squads, then I've got to extract me from that place or that point. I'll just tell you, in Vermont right now, there's only about 4 emergency response teams that are actually trained and outfitted to do extraction, a permit required confined space. So that's probably not our best way of having emergency services. As a matter of fact, the standard actually recommends non-entry rescue. It recommends non-entry rescue feasible. If that's not feasible, then I've got to make sure I've got the other one not just on standby, but ready to react to my needs, which might require them to be right on site. And again, making sure we have training and such aspect that everybody understands. When we look at the standard itself, 1200, when we standard itself, we start to look at the different types or examples of locations where confined spaces may occur. But again, bins, boilers, manholes, sewer, storm drains, electrical communication, utility vaults, tanks, enclosed beams, enclosed bridge beams, precast concrete. Here's a funny one, Cecil. If you get a DI delivered to your site and it's on the back of a truck, it is not a space. The minute ground confined space. Now, you can very easily keep a running tab and say, that's not hitched up yet, that's not this. It's included within our inventory, and as soon as that thing becomes live, then I've got to adjust. Anytime anything changes within that confined space, then I've got to change my inventory. And by changing my inventory, all I mean is we hitch it up, it goes live, we hitch pipes to it. I just continue to monitor the air in there so that I can assure everybody that that is not a permanent, it's just a confined space. So they're pretty clear there. The other piece that they talk about in this is that the excavation piece is exempt from it. So the excavation stand has its own, as we remember, its own little confined space piece in it, and there are two aspects of that. One is if I'm more than 4 feet deep in a landfill, dirty dirt, brown dirt, whatever you want to call it, dig a trench in more than deep, probably deep into space. And if I get to more, you start in that space piece, any other definition we're at, that's all in there except, of course, we have the attendant, which is permanent or somebody outside, authorized entrant or employee who's authorized by the entry supervisor to enter a permitted space, blinding the competent person piece, and then again included the confined space definition, large enough or so configured that an employee can bodily enter, has limited or restricted means for entry and exit, and is not for continuous employee. They also, controlling contractor is the employer, and that's where it gets kind of fuzzy, the employer that has overall responsibility for the construction at the work site. So if the owner is, then it is both a controlling contractor and a host employer. And I'm going to say that's where it starts to get fuzzy. If you're contracting with the Barton Water and Sewer Department to replace this, are overseeing the construction of this ACG, even though you may be hiring other subs underneath you, remember, they are the acting controlling contractor or host at all responsibility, and they push that responsibility back to you by supplying you with that inventory of what this confined space actually is. Early warning system, that is your that can be activated simply by having bad air or some other hazardous substance in there. An emergency is any occurrence, including failure of power, hazard control, monitoring equipment, and then this one here is entry means the action by which any part of a person passes through an opening into a permit required confined space. Now remember, as I'm talking about this, that entry, when you're doing or you're reauthorizing, the permit is to be something other than permit. Remember that as we enter my cup, but as we enter this, entry is not putting my hand through the hole into the coffee. Entry is actually the action by which I break these planes that go on forever. And again, I'll try to, so what they're saying is if I have a hole, a manhole, whatever, if I have this hole, before the top comes off, before anything happens, entry actually starts when I break that plane right there. Now, the process is I would do an air test here, and then I would do an air test at the top before removing it, and then I would remove the top and do an air test again. Then I would do an air test about halfway down and an air test. In the past, we've only required these 3 tests. Now we're saying we're going to do one with the air over the hole because I just broke the plane, and then across the top of this hole before removing the cover. So that would satisfy our entry categorizations. Before entry, I have to make sure everything is safe in there, but it's clear when any part of the body breaks the plane of an opening into the space, whether or not that action is intentional. Entry employer means any employer who decides that an employee directs will enter a permit, and the employer cannot avoid the duties of the standard simply by refusing. Permit is written to document those, and those have to be held on to entry for the project here afterwards. Entry rescue, when a rescue service enters a permitted space to rescue one or more employees, and then they added something new, but we had been using them somewhat anyway. The qualified person responsible for determining if an acceptable entry conditions are present. And they did add that an entry supervisor may also serve as the attendant or the authorized entrant in there. But they clearly spelled out and do it now. And then hazardous atmosphere, they did define the hazardous gas, any type of concentration of any substance that could be hazardous to us. Host employer owns or property where the construction is taking place. And that is a whole new term for us. And it's there's a whole new world right there. But they spell out pretty clearly if the owner of the property on which the construction activity occurs has contracted with an entity for general management of that property, then they own it at that point. But OSHA will treat the contracted management entity as the host employer for as long as that entity manages the property. Otherwise, OSHA will treat the owner of the property as the host employer, and in no case will there be more than one host employer. IDLH, again, immediately dangerous to life and health, and then isolation, limited or restricted means for entry or exit. Again, could be something as simple as trip hazards, poor illumination, slippery floors. They established the lower flammable limit, lower explosive limit. They do talk about monitoring, and then they discuss within the definition world non-entry rescue, and that occurs when a rescue service, usually the attendant, retrieves employees in a permit space without entering the permit space. They discuss here the non-permit confined space, means a confined space that meets the definition of a confined space but does not meet the definition of a permit. And again, the permit has would consider a non-permit. So spell out prohibited, oh God, that's tough today. Any condition in a permit space that is not allowed by the permit during the period. And qualified person, rescue and rescue service, and then they do spell out retrieval systems as well. So that kind of wraps up the definition side. The definition side, if anybody has any questions on definitions, I'm happy to take them. Okay. 1926-1203, before it begins work at a work site, each employer must ensure that a competent person, here's what I'm telling you, a competent person identify all confined spaces and one.
I call it, it's gone. The guy's and he said, it's gone.
And he won't answer his phone.
Good.
Try again, Deb. Give me 10 minutes.
Okay.
Before it begins work at a work site, each employer must ensure that a competent person identifies all confined spaces in which one or more of its employees' indirects may work. And so that goes back to that inventory piece, that if we're working in these, we have to check the inventory that the owner is carrying, and then we have to identify and categorize the, if it has we have to identify and clearly mark those confined spaces as being permitted spaces, if they are. Anytime I'm dealing with a permit space, identify that as a permitted space. Under D, if an employer decides that employees it directs will enter a permit space, the employer must have a written permit space program that complies with 1204. And all it's saying is, you don't know if the permit or not permitted prior to you taking this on. And really what it's saying is, in order for you to recategorize them or reestablish them as non-permits, you have to have a written permitted confined space program that allows you to do so. So, and we'll hit that in a little while, but we've got to have a written permit space program. And again, it's got to be made available prior to and during entry operations. So really what it's saying is that permit program, those survey sheets, and that permit system on site, and have to be readily available at that entry point. Means you might want to have a notebook, or you might want to have plastic sheets with these permits in them at that point of entry. Then it tells us under E that an employer, and this is the most important, I believe, the most important aspect of this whole piece. An employer's employee or permit space need not comply with level 4, 6, 8, and 11 provide telling you that you could use another thing. Even though they say it's a permit, you can recategorize that to be a non-permit place. The employer can demonstrate that all physical hazards in the space are eliminated or isolated through engineering controls, so that only the hazard posed by the permit space is actual or potential hazardous atmosphere. If I can remove everything else, and all we're saying is I got bad air, and I'm monitoring 100% of the time, and I've got a blower in there to clear that air, then I could, in essence, call it a non-permit space. The employer can demonstrate that continuous forced air ventilation alone is sufficient to maintain that permit space. And the employer develops monitoring and inspection data that supports those demonstrations. If entry is necessary to do that, it has to be under the terms of a full permitted space until such time that I can recategorize it. Again, operation, entry or permit one, any condition it unsafe to remove an entry cover must be eliminated before the cover is removed. Again, that's where it comes down to testing about 3 feet over the cover, testing across the cover, and then removing the cover and test. If the monitor goes off in that aspect, those entry, or I've got to treat it as a continuously. Enters the space, the internal atmosphere must be tested, again with a calibrated direct reading instrument for oxygen, flammable gases, vapors, toxic air contaminants in that order. Again, vapor, any employee who enters the space or that employee's representative must be provided an opportunity to observe pre-entry. Testing required by this paragraph. And we can, no hazardous atmosphere is permitted within the space whenever an employee is inside that space. Again, we're taking that thing from a permit to a non-permit, so I can't have hazardous atmospheres in there. And if I'm using continuous forced air ventilation, it's got to be used until the forced air has eliminated all hazards, and the forced air must be so directed as to ventilate the immediate areas where that person is actually working. And I'm doing testing within that space and within that work area to ensure that that bad air is not coming back. What I said earlier is the atmosphere, and that's that piece where continuous monitoring, the actual spelling of it is the atmosphere within the space. That's it. Categorize the making the word we make entry. Inventory we have, then it's considered a permit. If I don't permit, then all
testing 1 2 3 testing 1 2
they can respond in a timely manner. Hazards there, training, and when we start to get into and people that attend lightheaded, confusion, whatnot, we've got attend any right out. Of attendance, again, where a positive should be very aware of, and again, contains a, and that they go any place. They don't go to get anything. They remain outside working. Again, the entry employer must ensure that each entry supervisor is familiar with and understands the hazards, verifies by checking the appropriate have been made on the permit survey, and verifies rescue services are available, or that the attendant is properly trained, and that my tripod or non-entry rescue, and then determine data and information that is. That covers the standard per se. Two other things, I believe it's 2 other things I want to take a look at, and I want to will be available. I know all this stuff. This is the confined space superintendent. It's done. What we do here is have the entrant attendant, and every time I'm on permit for entry, I put everything in place that was necessary, and we just keep space. Trying to get you to a hazardous. Remember the way you're put a blower atmosphere, and if we take it from a hazardous by using a blower to make that happen. It was 4 late, and we could with them. And the last to include program anything that's there, a pig in the line, ventilation, and then continuously monitoring, and then identify within that permit system what our emergency rescue procedure for that. Recategorization, survey, whether it's a hazardous atmosphere only or any would be annual review, program reviews, and looking for one, and then I include that. My other one, please replace this. And one, we would all edit in. I see that you're.
Questions for me?
With that all being said, I will review work for it as possible. Next.
Okay, that for sure has changed everything. Let's try relaunching that. I know that we will have to wait quite some time for it to actually just launch. And I would say this will be the last time of this actually being streamed. So, time to shift everything over. Okay, I see a spot for 2. It says it's running. Okay, I'll just do Ubisoft, like 2 games from there. And I want to try making that run. Oh. Okay. Come on, can you load? Good. Now it loads. Can you load? Come on. Come on. Why won't you load? I'm waiting. I'm just done. There we go. Getting off this, I'm going to address them, and then I'm going to go to bed. You're blowing out your candles quite some time ago. Or the whole chair